SEAL Admiral asked a single-dad mechanic his call sign as a joke until Shadow Wolf made him salute. He laughed at the quiet mechanic fixing his car until one word, Shadow Wolf, made the Admiral freeze, salute, and realize he just mocked the deadliest hero who ever walked away from war to save a little girl. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered sign of Mercer's Auto Repair as Jake wiped the sweat from his brow. The familiar scent of motor oil and grease filled the air of his small garage, mixing with the earthy smell of red clay dust that seemed to coat everything in this part of the state. Through the open bay door, waves of heat rippled off the asphalt of the empty main street. Inside his office, Maggie sat at a small desk, her legs swinging freely as she concentrated on her math homework. Her pink pencil moved carefully across the paper. Tongue stuck out slightly in concentration. Jake smiled at the sight through the grimy window between the garage and office. That little girl had saved him in more ways than she'd ever know. The steady rhythm of Jake's work on Mrs. Henderson's pickup truck filled the quiet afternoon. His prosthetic leg barely slowed him down anymore as he moved between his toolbox and the vehicle, each motion practiced and precise. 8 years of civilian life had taught him to adapt, to find new ways to do what needed doing. A sputtering sound broke through the afternoon quiet, growing louder as it approached. Jake recognized the distinctive rumble of a V8 engine in distress even before he saw the car. The sleek lines of a classic Mustang came into view, the candy apple red paint job dulled by a fine layer of road dust. The engine coughed once more before the car rolled to a stop right outside his garage. Jake set down his wrench and grabbed a shop rag to wipe his hands. As he stepped out into the scorching heat, he could see the driver, an older man with military straight posture, climbing out of the driver's seat. Everything about him screamed career military. The precise haircut, the crisp polo shirt tucked into pressed khakis, the way he surveyed his surroundings with tactical awareness. "Having some trouble?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral and professional. The older man turned, his expression a mix of frustration and barely concealed disdain. "Damn thing started running rough about 10 miles back. Shouldn't have listened to my grandson about taking the scenic route through these back roads." Jake nodded, already moving toward the front of the car. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest," the man said, waving his hand dismissively. "Though I doubt you'll find anything my regular mechanic in Mobile missed during the last service." Ignoring the implied slight, Jake popped the hood. The engine bay was immaculate. There was immaculate problem. Someone had put a lot of love into maintaining this. Classic. But Jake's experienced eyes quickly spotted the issue. "Your distributor cap is cracked," he said, pointing to the hairline fracture. "It's letting moisture in, causing misfires. Simple fix." The older man stepped closer, squinting at where Jake pointed. "And I suppose you just happen to have a distributor cap for a '65 Mustang lying around?" Jake allowed himself a small smile. "Actually, I do. Restored one last summer. Had to order extra parts because you never know what might be defective." He turned toward the office. "Maggie, honey, can you grab the small brown box marked Mustang from the third shelf?" Maggie looked up from her homework, her face brightening at the chance to help. She hopped up and disappeared into the storage room, returning moments later with the requested box. As she approached, she gave the Mustang an appreciative look. "It's pretty," she said, handing the box to Jake, "like a candy apple." The older man's stern expression softened slightly at Maggie's comment, but he quickly covered it with a harumph. "At least someone in this town has good taste in automobiles." Jake opened the box and pulled out the distributor cap, holding it up for inspection. "This should have you back on the road in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes? The man's eyebrows rose. "The shop in Mobile quoted me 2 hours for diagnostic time alone." "No need for diagnostics when you can spot the problem," Jake replied, already gathering his tools. He worked methodically, his movements efficient and precise. The older man watched with poorly concealed interest as Jake's hands moved surely through the repair. "Military?" the man asked suddenly, gesturing to Jake's prosthetic leg. Jake nodded without looking up from his work. Something like that. Which branch? Navy. The man stood a little straighter. Admiral Silas Grant, retired. Where did you serve? Here and there, Jake replied vaguely, focusing on securing the new distributor cap in place. Admiral Grant's eyes narrowed at the evasive answer. Unit? That's all set, Jake said, deliberately ignoring the question as he closed the hood. Try starting her up. The Admiral's jaw tightened at being brushed off, but he slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The Mustang's engine roared to life, settling into a smooth idle that was worlds better than its earlier sputtering. Well, I'll be damned, Grant muttered, stepping out of the car. He reached for his wallet. What do I owe you? Parts and half an hour of labor, Jake said, quoting a fair price. The Admiral counted out the bills, adding a generous tip that Jake tried to refuse. Keep it, Grant insisted. Not often you find someone who knows what they're doing in these small towns. He paused, a hint of amusement crossing his face. What's your call sign, Grease Monkey? Shadow Wolf? Jake went completely still, his hand frozen in the act of accepting the payment. The afternoon heat seemed to press in even heavier as he replied quietly, Used to be. The change in Admiral Grant's expression was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face as his eyes widened in recognition. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Without another word, Jake turned and walked back into his shop, leaving the stunned Admiral standing in the shimming heat beside his perfectly running Mustang. The neon sign of Mary's Corner Diner buzzed and flickered against the darkening Alabama sky. Inside, Admiral Silas Grant sat alone in a worn vinyl booth, his coffee growing cold and untouched. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he stared at the yellowed newspaper clipping he always kept in his wallet. SEAL Team missing in action. Presumed dead, the headline declared. Below it, a grainy photo showed a group of soldiers, their faces serious and determined. Third from the left stood Jake Shadow Wolf Mercer, looking younger but just as resolute as the man Silas had met hours ago at the garage. The bold diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Betty, the elderly waitress, approached with a pot of fresh coffee. You okay there, Admiral? Looking like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, Betty. Maybe I have. He accepted the refill with a distracted nod. The mission details flooded back, crystal clear, despite the years that had passed. Operation Desert Phantom, SI, a classified insertion deep behind enemy lines. As Pacific Fleet Commander, he'd signed the orders himself, sending Shadow Wolf's team to what seemed like certain death. The intel had been wrong. Everything had gone sideways. It can't be him, Silas muttered, but he knew better. Those eyes, they were the same ones he'd seen in the mission briefing photos. The slight limp, the prosthetic leg, the M. It all fit the aftermath reports of the explosion that had supposedly killed the entire team. Except Jake hadn't died. He'd survived and chosen to disappear. The next morning dawned humid and heavy. Silas guided his Mustang back to a bow. Mercer's auto repair, the engine's rough idle, providing a convenient excuse for his return. The garage's bay doors were already open, country music playing softly from an old radio. Jake looked up from under the hood of a pickup truck, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of the Admiral, but his voice remained professionally neutral. Back so soon? Engines still running a bit rough, Silas said, patting the Mustang's hood. Thought maybe you could take another look. Jake nodded once, his movements deliberate and controlled as he approached the car. Pop the hood. The two men stood side by side, studying the engine in silence. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice low. You know, losing Shadow Wolf's team hit a lot of us hard. Some folks never really recovered from that day. Jake's hands stilled on the timing belt he'd been examining. For a long moment, only the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine filled the air. This timing belt needs replacing, he said finally. pointedly ignoring the Admiral's comment. "I can have it done by tomorrow afternoon." "Jake," Silas started. "It's just Mercer now." Jake cut him off, his voice firm but not unkind. "Or the mechanic works fine too." Before Silas could respond, a high-pitched voice rang out across the garage. "Daddy!" Maggie came bounding in from the office, her backpack bouncing against her small frame, dark pigtails swinging. Jake's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. The tension in his shoulders melted away as he caught her in his arms, swinging her up in a practiced motion that spoke of countless similar greetings. "Hey, princess," Jake said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "How was school?" "We learned about butterflies today. I drew you a picture." She proudly held up a slightly crumpled piece of paper covered in colorful crayon drawings. Silas watched the interaction with growing understanding. The hardened seal he'd known from mission reports had been replaced by something else entirely, a devoted father whose whole world clearly revolved around this little girl. Jake set Maggie down gently. "Why don't you go put your stuff in the office? I'll be there in a minute to look at that picture." As Maggie skipped away, Jake turned back to Silas, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you came here to say, leave it in the past where it belongs. I left that life for her." He gestured in the direction his daughter had gone. "She's all that matters now." Silas looked at the man before him, the decorated warrior who had chosen to trade his weapons for wrenches, his tactical gear for a mechanic's coveralls, who had found something worth more than duty, honor, or glory. Without another word, the Admiral got back into his Mustang. The engine turned over with a roar, and he drove away, leaving Jake standing in the doorway of his garage. In his rearview mirror, he could see Maggie running back out to her father, paper held high, and Jake kneeling down to give her his full attention. The image stayed with Silas long after the garage had disappeared from view. The more he thought about it, the more questions surfaced about the mission, about Jake's survival, about the little girl who had given a ghost a reason to live again. But for now, those questions would have to wait. The Saturday morning sun painted golden streaks across the cracked asphalt of Thompson's grocery parking lot. Jake Mercer's old blue pickup truck rattled into a spot near the entrance, its engine ticking as it cooled. Maggie bounced in her seat, her brown pigtails swinging with excitement. "Can I push the cart, Dad? Please?" She looked up at him with those big brown eyes that never failed to melt his resolve. Jake's lips curved into a small smile. "Sure thing, kiddo. Just no racing down the aisles this time." Inside the store, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maggie gripped the shopping cart handle, her face scrunched in concentration as she carefully navigated between the produce displays. Jake walked beside her, his prosthetic leg making a subtle click against the linoleum floor. "We need vegetables," Jake reminded her, reaching for a bunch of carrots. Maggie wrinkled her nose. "Do we have to?" "Yes, ma'am. Growing girls need their greens." He added some broccoli to their cart, ignoring her dramatic sigh. They worked their way through their usual shopping route, Jake consulting his carefully written list while Maggie suggested additions that mostly involved cookies or candy. As they passed the birthday card section, Maggie suddenly stopped. "Dad?" Her voice had that thoughtful tone that usually meant she'd been planning something. "You know my birthday's coming up in 2 weeks?" Jake nodded, already wary. "Sure do. The big 9. "Well," Maggie traced patterns on the cart handle with her finger. "I was thinking maybe, instead of a regular party, we could do something different." "Different how?" "Like a daddy and daughter day." The words burst out of her in a rush of enthusiasm. "We could invite other dads and their daughters to the garage, and you could teach them stuff about cars, and we could have snacks, and maybe you could show them how to change a tire or something." Jake's hand tightened on the shopping cart. His first instinct was to say no. The garage was his sanctuary, his quiet place away from questions and curious eyes. But Maggie was looking up at him with such hope, such pure excitement. That's quite an idea, Mags." He kept his voice steady. Buying time. How many people were you thinking about? Just a few. Maggie's words tumbled out faster now. Like Sarah and her dad, and maybe Emma and Mr. Johnson, and Katie and her daddy from church. Not too many. Please, Dad? It would be the best birthday ever. Jake reached down to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Let me think about it, okay? That's a pretty big event to plan. Maggie nodded, but her smile dimmed just a little. They finished their shopping in comfortable silence, though Jake could see her stealing hopeful glances at him as they loaded groceries into the truck. Later that night, after Maggie was tucked into bed, Jake sat alone on the front porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath his rocking chair as crickets chirped their evening symphony. In his hands, he held an old photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. 6 men stood in the desert sun, their faces streaked with camouflage paint and desert dust. Jake's finger traced over each familiar face. Brothers who had trusted him with their lives. Brothers who had followed him into hell and back. Brothers who still haunted his dreams. He set the photo on his knee and pulled out Maggie's latest crayon drawing from his shirt pocket. It showed stick figures of various sizes, all holding hands in front of what was clearly meant to be his garage. Daddy and Daughter Day was written across the top in wobbly rainbow letters. The contrast between the two images made his chest ache. Those two worlds weren't meant to touch. He'd built this quiet life brick by brick, wrench by wrench, specifically to keep Maggie safe from his past, to keep her innocent of the shadows that sometimes still woke him in cold sweats. But as he looked at her drawing again, he couldn't deny the simple joy in those crayon lines. She wasn't asking for much, just a day to share her dad with her friends, to show them the place where he worked, the skills he used to help people fix their cars instead of breaking things. Jake reached for the small notebook he kept in his back pocket. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began sketching out ideas. Simple demonstrations that would be safe for kids. Basic tools they could handle. Areas that would need to be roped off. Maybe he could set up a small station where they could learn to check tire pressure or oil levels. His hand paused over the paper. The thought of other people in his space, other eyes watching him work, made his shoulders tense. But then he remembered Maggie's face in the grocery store, how her whole body had lit up with excitement at the idea. She was proud of him, of what he did. Not Shadow Wolf the seal, but Jake Mercer the mechanic, her dad. The crickets sang louder as night deepened, and Jake continued to sketch his plans in the yellow porch light. Each line was a battle between his instinct to hide and his desire to give his daughter the birthday she wanted. He didn't know which side would win yet, but for now, he kept drawing, kept planning, kept trying to find a way to bridge his two worlds without breaking either one. The morning dew still clung to the grass when Admiral Silas Grant's Mustang pulled up to Jake's garage. He sat in the car for a moment, 2 paper cups of coffee steaming in the holders, watching Jake work through the open bay door. The mechanic moved with precise efficiency, his prosthetic leg hardly affecting his fluid movements as he checked the alignment on an old Chevy. Silas grabbed the coffees and stepped out, his shoes crunching on the gravel. Jake looked up, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag and gave a slight nod. "Thought you might need this," Silas said, extending one of the cups. "Black, 2 sugars. Old habit from the service. Most operators I knew took it that way." Jake accepted the coffee with a quiet thanks. His eyes held a flicker of recognition at the small gesture. The kind of thing commanding officers used to do for their men before difficult missions. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee and looking at the Mustang. The morning birds called from nearby trees, their songs mixing with the soft whir of the shop fan. "She's coming along," Jake finally said, gesturing to the car. "Found the issue with the timing belt. Should have her purring by Wednesday." Silas nodded, but they both knew he wasn't here about the car. He cleared his throat. "You know, for years I thought, we all thought, that I was dead." Jake's voice was steady. "Matter of fact, Sometimes I wished I was. The weight of those words hung heavy in the morning air. Silas watched as Jake moved to his workbench, arranging tools with methodical precision, a habit born from years of military discipline. "Why did you disappear?" Silas asked softly. "After the hospital. After recovery. You just vanished." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on a wrench. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Lost my whole team that day. Rodriguez, Matthews, Carson. They had families, kids." His knuckles went white around the wrench. "I led them in. I was supposed to bring them home." Silas stepped closer, his coffee forgotten. "The intel was bad. We didn't know." "Doesn't matter what we knew," Jake cut in. "I was their team leader. Every night I see their faces. Hear Matthews talking about his son's baseball game. Rodriguez showing pictures of his new baby." He set the wrench down, with careful control. "The medals, the honors, they felt like a mockery. So I left." "And Maggie?" Silas asked gently. A different kind of pain crossed Jake's face. "Sarah, Rodriguez's sister, she couldn't. After losing him, she fell apart. Drugs." He swallowed hard. "I'd check on her sometimes. Tried to help. When she got pregnant with Maggie, she cleaned up for a while, but—" He shook his head. "Maggie was 2 when Sarah overdosed. No other family. I couldn't let her end up in the system." "So you became a father," Silas said softly. Jake's expression softened slightly. "Best mission I ever accepted. She saved me as much as I saved her, given me something to live for, to be better for." Silas set his coffee down, his hands shaking slightly. "Jake, I need to tell you something." He took a deep breath. "That mission. I signed the order. The intel came across my desk, and his voice cracked. "I approved it. All these years, knowing what happened. It's eaten at me." Jake studied the older man's face, seeing the genuine anguish there. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of birds and the soft whir of the shop fan. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "We all did our duty, Admiral. You made the best call you could with what you knew. I've made my peace with that." Silas's eyes grew wet. "How can you?" "Because holding on to it doesn't bring them back," Jake said. "And it doesn't help Maggie grow up in a world where her daddy can't forgive." From inside the house came the clatter of pans, and a young voice called out, "Daddy, I made pancakes." A small, genuine smile crossed Jake's face. He looked at Silas and said quietly, "Excuse me, Admiral. That's my real mission." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who had found his true purpose, not in combat or glory, but in the simple, profound act of being a father. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Jake walked with Maggie, a stack of bright yellow flyers tucked under his arm. The paper announced Daddy and Daughter Day at Mercer's Garage in bold letters, with cheerful drawings of tools and hearts that Maggie had added herself. "Can we put one in Miss Sarah's bakery window?" Maggie bounced alongside him, her dark curls swaying with each step. "She always gives me a cookie when we go in." Jake smiled down at his daughter. "Sure thing, sweetheart." Miss Sarah's first on the list. The bell above the bakery door chimed as they entered. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air. Sarah, the elderly owner, brightened at the sight of them. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers, what brings you two by today?" Maggie ran up to the counter. "We're having a special day at Daddy's Garage. Can we put up a flyer?" Of course, honey." Sarah took the offered paper, studying it with genuine interest. "What a wonderful idea. I'll put it right here in the front window where everyone can see it." As they continued down Main Street, the reception grew noticeably cooler. The hardware store owner barely glanced at them before mumbling something about no space for another flyer. The cafe manager just shook his head. and turned away. Maggie's initial excitement began to fade. "Why don't they want our flyers, Daddy?" Jake squeezed her hand. "Sometimes people are just busy, Princess. Don't worry about it." They approached Thompson's General Store, where a group of men lounged outside on wooden chairs. Jake felt their stares as he and Maggie passed by. He'd learned to recognize that particular kind of look, the one that said they saw his prosthetic leg and Maggie's brown skin and decided they knew everything about him. "Hey there, Shadow Wolf," one of the men called out mockingly. Jake kept walking, keeping Maggie close. Another man spat on the ground and muttered something under his breath. Ugly words about mixed families that made Jake's jaw clench. He felt Maggie's hand tighten in his, and his heart ached, knowing she was old enough to understand the tone, if not the exact words. Jake stopped and knelt down to Maggie's level, his prosthetic leg adjusting smoothly with the motion. He looked into her eyes, seeing the hurt there that she was trying so hard to hide. "How about we go get some ice cream?" he asked softly. "I think we've put up enough flyers for today." Maggie nodded, managing a small smile. "Can I get chocolate chip?" "You can get whatever flavor you want, sweetheart." They walked to the ice cream parlor at the end of the street, leaving the rest of the flyers tucked away in Jake's back pocket. He listened as Maggie chatted about her latest art project, marveling at her resilience. The ice cream shop owner, Mrs. Chen, welcomed them warmly, and even offered to put up a flyer in her window without being asked. The sun was setting by the time they headed home. Jake helped Maggie with her homework, made dinner, and tucked her into bed with their usual bedtime story. She fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed elephant, the one he'd given her the day the adoption became final. After making sure Maggie was sound asleep, Jake stepped out to move his truck into the garage for the night. The overhead security light cast harsh shadows across the driveway. As he approached the vehicle, something white caught his eye. A piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. His combat instincts, never fully dormant, heightened as he reached for the paper. The message was typed in plain black letters. "We don't need your kind here." Jake stood perfectly still, reading the words again. The paper crinkled slightly in his grip as memories of other threats, other dangers flashed through his mind. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was his home, where his daughter slept peacefully just yards away. With controlled movements, he walked into his office and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a small box containing things he never wanted Maggie to see. His Purple Heart, the folded flag from his team's memorial service, and now, this note. He placed the paper in the box and closed the drawer, his jaw tight with the effort of restraint. Through the window, he could see Maggie's nightlight casting a gentle glow through her curtains. That light, that peace, was what mattered, not the darkness that some people carried in their hearts. Jake took a deep breath and straightened up. Tomorrow would be another day. Tomorrow they would continue planning their event, continue building their life here, continue proving that love was stronger than hate. But for now, he needed to check the locks one more time and try to get some sleep. As he made his final security sweep of the house, Jake's thoughts weren't on the threat or the men who'd tried to intimidate him. Instead, he thought about the drawings Maggie had made for the flyers, about Mrs. Chen's kindness, about Sarah's genuine smile. He thought about all the reasons he'd chosen this quiet life, and all the reasons it was worth fighting for. Not with fists or weapons, but with patience, dignity, and unwavering love for the little girl who had saved him as much as he had saved her. The morning sun beat down on the garage's weathered sign as Jake worked under the hood of a beaten-up pickup truck. His hands moved with practiced precision, finding problems and solutions with equal ease. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled his nostrils, a comfort zone he'd carved out for himself in this small corner of Alabama. The crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Jake didn't need to look up to know it was Admiral Silas Grant's Mustang. The distinctive purr of that engine had become familiar over the past week. "Morning, Jake," Silas called out, his boots scraping against the concrete floor as he approached. In his hands, he held what looked like an old folded newsletter. Jake straightened up, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Admiral, the Mustang giving you trouble again?" No, she's running better than ever." Silas's face held an expression Jake recognized from his military days, the look of a man about to breach a difficult subject. "Found something interesting in my old files last night." Jake's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, as Silas unfolded the newsletter. The yellowed paper bore the Navy's insignia at the top, dated nearly a decade ago. "Shadow Wolf leads successful extraction in hostile territory," Silas read aloud. "Lieutenant Jake Mercer's tactical expertise saves 12 civilian hostages." He looked up at Jake. "You were more than just another SEAL, son. You were a legend." Jake turned back to the truck engine, his shoulders tense. "That was another life. A life worth remembering," Silas pressed, following him around the vehicle. "Those 12 families got to see their loved ones again because of you. That kind of leadership, that kind of courage, it doesn't just disappear." Through the office window, Jake could see Maggie at her usual spot. Tongue stuck out in concentration as she worked on her math homework. She looked up and waved, her smile brightening his world like it did every single time. "I lead a different kind of life now," Jake said quietly. Silas laid the newsletter on the workbench. "You're still leading, Jake. Whether you see it or not, that daddy and daughter day idea of yours, that's leadership. Standing tall when others try to push you down, that's courage." Jake picked up a wrench, turning it over in his calloused hands. "Some folks around here might disagree with that assessment. All the more reason to step into the light," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "You've got influence, Jake. More than you know. That little girl in there, she sees it. I see it. The way you handle yourself, the respect you show others even when they don't deserve it. That's the kind of example this town needs." Jake's hand unconsciously moved to his prosthetic leg, a habit he'd developed when deep in thought. The metal and plastic under his jeans represented both loss and survival, a permanent reminder of the price of service. "I didn't come here to be an example," Jake said. "I came here to give Maggie a normal life." "And you have," Silas agreed. "But maybe that's not where the story ends. Maybe there's more good you can do, right here, right now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Jake looked at the newsletter again, at the younger version of himself mentioned in those lines of text. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the fierce determination to protect those in his care. "I'll think about it," Jake finally said, his voice low but steady. Silas nodded, knowing better than to push further. "That's all I ask." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "By the way, Mayor Brooks mentioned the Memorial Day event coming up. Said she could use someone with your background to speak about service, about unity." Jake watched the Admiral's departure through the garage's open door, his mind already turning over the implications of stepping into such a public role. The newsletter lay on his workbench, like a bridge between his past and present. Later that evening, Jake sat on the edge of Maggie's bed, their nightly ritual of prayers coming to a close. Her room was a splash of color against the otherwise modest house. Drawings taped to walls, bright blankets, and a string of fairy lights that made shadows dance across the ceiling. "Wilson's cat find its way home," Maggie finished, her hands clasped together. Then she opened her eyes, looking at Jake with that penetrating gaze that sometimes made him wonder who was raising whom. "Daddy?" "Yes." "Sweetheart? Were you a hero?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Like in the stories?" Jake's throat tightened. He reached out to smooth her hair, buying time to find the right words. The newsletter's headlines flashed through his mind, along with memories of missions he'd never share, of brothers he'd lost, of choices that still woke him in the night. "I used to be," he said softly. "Now I just want to be your hero." Maggie's arms wrapped around his neck in a fierce hug. "You already are," she whispered. After tucking her in and turning off the lights, Jake stood in the hallway for a long moment. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant song of crickets through the open windows. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Mayor Brooks's number, which he'd saved after their last interaction about business permits. His thumb hovered over the call button as Silas's words echoed in his mind. "Step into the light." The phone rang twice. Before Mayor Brooks answered, "Jake, this is unexpected." "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "About the Memorial Day event. If you still need a speaker, I'd like to help." There was a pause on the other end, then a warm response. "We'd be honored to have you, Jake. Truly honored." As he ended the call, Jake looked back at Maggie's door, where a sliver of fairy light still peeked through the bottom crack. Sometimes, he realized, being a hero meant more than just saving lives in far-off places. Sometimes it meant standing up, speaking out, and showing your daughter that courage came in many forms. The early morning light barely touched the horizon when Jake pulled up to his garage in his old pickup truck. Maggie sat beside him, her pink backpack clutched to her chest, still sleepy from their morning routine. She'd insisted on coming early to work on a special drawing for their upcoming Daddy and Daughter Day event. Jake's hands tightened on the work steering wheel as he rounded the corner. The garage door came into view, and his heart stopped. Crude black spray paint defaced the front of his business. A massive swastika sprawled across the white surface, its edges dripping with fresh paint. In one fluid motion, Jake reached over and gently covered Maggie's eyes with his calloused hand. "Hey, sweetheart, keep those eyes closed for me, okay?" "Why, Daddy?" Maggie asked, her voice small and confused. "Just trust me for a minute." Jake helped her out of the truck, keeping her facing away from the garage. He guided her to the small office door on the side. "Remember that new coloring book we got? Why don't you start working on that while I make a quick phone call?" Once Maggie was settled at her usual spot, Jake stepped outside and pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the police, more from anger than fear. While he waited, he stared at the hateful symbol, his jaw clenched tight. Officer Martinez arrived, first, notebook in hand. She took photos and asked questions with professional detachment, but Jake could see the sympathy in her eyes. "Any ideas who might have done this, Mr. Mercer?" Jake shook his head. "Could be anyone who doesn't like newcomers, or maybe someone who saw the flyers for the event." The crunch of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Admiral Silas Grant's restored Mustang pulled up, and the older man climbed out, his face darkening as he took in the scene. "Good Lord above," he muttered. Then his voice rose with anger. "This is absolutely unacceptable, Admiral." Jake acknowledged quietly. "It's just paint. Just paint." Silas's face reddened. "This is a hate crime, son. You need to press charges when they find who did this." Jake crossed his arms, his voice staying low and controlled. "Without evidence, that'll just make things worse. Right now, it's anonymous cowards with spray paint. If we push too hard, they might get bolder." Officer Martinez finished her report and promised to increase patrols in the area. After she left, Silas stayed, pacing in front of the garage like an agitated guard dog. "You can't let them get away with this, Jake. You're a decorated veteran, for heaven's sake." "That's exactly why I can't react," Jake replied, already pulling supplies from his truck. "I've seen what escalation does, Admiral. It never ends well." The morning progressed as Jake methodically covered the hatred with fresh paint. Each stroke of white erased another piece of the ugly mark, but he knew the real stain went deeper than surface level. Silas insisted on staying, making calls on his phone, and occasionally helping move equipment. Around noon, the screen door creaked open. Maggie stepped out carrying a tray with 2 glasses of lemonade, ice cubes clinking against the sides. Her smile was as bright as the sun overhead. "I made it myself, Daddy." "Well, from the powder stuff. But I did all the stirring." Jake set down his paint roller and knelt to her level, careful to keep his paint-splattered clothes from touching her clean sundress. "That's exactly what I needed, Princess. Thank you." Maggie looked at his work, then back at him. "Is that why you made me close my eyes this morning? Because someone made a mess on our garage?" Jake pulled her into a gentle hug, his heart swelling with love for this perceptive little girl who somehow always knew the right thing to say. "Yeah, baby. Someone made a mess, but we're fixing it. That's what we do, right?" She nodded against his shoulder. "Like when I spilled juice on my homework and we dried it out and rewrote it all nice and neat." "Just like that," Jake whispered, holding her close. "No one will chase us away, Maggie. This is our home." The Admiral watched the exchange, his earlier anger softening at the sight. He picked up a spare roller and dipped it in paint. "Well then," he said gruffly, "let's get this home of yours looking proper again." The afternoon wore on as 3 generations worked together, erasing hate with simple, determined strokes of white paint. Every so often, Maggie would emerge with more lemonade or to show them a new drawing, her presence a reminder of why this battle was worth fighting, not with fists or fury, but with quiet dignity and unwavering resolve. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake's garage as he arranged the last of the orange safety cones in the parking lot. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, though his heart raced with uncertainty. Colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze, tied to makeshift posts around the work area. Maggie bounced around in her new coveralls, 7'9", a miniature version of Jake's, with "Birthday Girl" spelled out in sparkly letters across the back. Her dark curls were pulled back in 2 neat braids, courtesy of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who had come over early just to help. "Do you think anyone will really come, Daddy?" Maggie asked, adjusting the safety goggles. Perched on her head, Jake knelt down beside her, his prosthetic leg barely making a sound. "Even if it's just us, Princess, we'll make it special." He tapped her nose gently, earning a giggle. The rumble of an approaching car made them both look up. Admiral Silas Grant's freshly repaired Mustang pulled into the lot, followed by 2 more vehicles. Jake's throat tightened as he watched 3 young girls practically drag their fathers from their cars. "Mr. Mercer," called out little Sarah Johnson, her red hair flying behind her as she ran up. "Daddy said we could stay all morning." Within 30 minutes, the parking lot had transformed. 8 father-daughter pairs gathered around Jake as he demonstrated proper tire-changing technique. The men stood awkwardly at first, some avoiding eye contact, others shifting uncomfortably in their Sunday clothes. "First rule of the garage," Jake announced, his quiet voice somehow carrying across the group, "is safety first." He helped Maggie hold up various tools, explaining each one's purpose. "Second rule, getting your hands dirty is part of the job." The first tire change race brought out competitive spirits. Mr. Thompson, the local banker, rolled up his sleeves with determination while his daughter, Emily, cheered him on. Jake moved between the pairs, offering gentle corrections and encouragement. "Remember, steady hands. Save time," he advised, helping one frustrated father position his jack properly. Just like that. Silas worked the stopwatch, calling out times and keeping score on a large whiteboard. His military bearing had softened into something more grandfatherly as he high-fived excited girls and praised their efforts. By mid-morning, the initial tension had melted away. Fathers who'd arrived in pressed shirts now sported grease smudges and proud grins. Their daughters beamed as they learned to check oil levels and identify basic engine parts. "My daddy says you were a soldier," one little girl said to Jake during the break. While everyone enjoyed lemonade and cookies, Jake glanced at Maggie, who was showing her friends how to make paper airplanes. "I was," he replied simply. "He was more than that," Silas interjected, walking up with a fresh pitcher. "He was a hero. Jake shook his head slightly. But before he could respond, it was time for the next activity. He'd set up simple diagnostic stations where fathers and daughters could work together to solve basic car problems. "Remember, ladies," Jake called out, "sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. Check your connections first." The afternoon brought more surprises. Mr. Davidson, who'd once crossed the street to avoid Jake, now asked detailed questions about engine maintenance. His daughter Lucy proudly showed off the junior mechanic certificate Jake had prepared for each girl. As the sun began to dip, parents started gathering their things. The girls hugged Maggie goodbye, chattering about next time. Jake noticed several fathers exchanging phone numbers, planning carpools for future playdates. "This was awesome, Mr. Mercer," Emily Thompson declared, her face smudged with grease but glowing with happiness. "Can we do it again next month?" Jake looked around at the hopeful faces. "We'll see," he said, but his smile gave away his answer. As the last car pulled away, Silas helped Jake and Maggie collect tools and clean up. The garage looked lived in now, with new memories etched into its walls alongside the old oil stains. "You're changing lives," Silas said quietly, watching Jake store the safety equipment. Jake paused, considering the day's events. "It felt good," he admitted. "Different kind of mission. But," he trailed off, understanding dawning in his eyes. Maggie wrapped her arms around Jake's waist, her face pressed against his side. "Best birthday ever," she declared, squeezing tight. The morning after the Daddy and Daughter Day event, Jake was elbow deep in an old Ford's engine when Mayor Evelyn, Brooks's sensible sedan, pulled into the garage's parking lot. He wiped his hands on a shop rag as she stepped out, her usual formal attire replaced by a casual blouse and slacks. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she called out, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. "Got a minute to chat?" Jake nodded, gesturing toward the small office where Maggie usually did her homework. The space was humble but neat, with crayon drawings decorating one wall and a coffee maker bubbling in the corner. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." Mayor Brooks settled into the worn chair across from his desk. "I heard wonderful things about yesterday's event." Several council members' daughters couldn't stop talking about it. Jake poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to her. "Just trying to make my little girl happy," he said quietly. "You did more than that." The mayor's eyes were warm but calculating. "You brought people together. That's no small feat in a town like ours, especially given recent events." Jake's jaw tightened slightly at the reference to the vandalism, but he remained silent. "The town council and I have been discussing nominations for this year's Heart of Valor Award," she continued, stirring sugar into her coffee. "It's our highest civilian honor, given to those who demonstrate exceptional service to the community." "Ma'am," Jake started to protest, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. We've watched how you've handled everything thrown at you. The grace you've shown in the face of prejudice, the way you've focused on building bridges instead of walls." She leaned forward. "That's the kind of leadership this town needs." Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garage where he'd hosted dozens of fathers and daughters just yesterday. "I appreciate the thought, Mayor Brooks, but I'm not looking for recognition. Everything I do is for Maggie. Sometimes the things we do for our children end up helping entire communities," she pressed, gently. "Think about it. The ceremony isn't for another month." Jake turned back to her, his expression resolute. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've had enough spotlights in my life. I'm just a mechanic now. That's all I want to be." The mayor nodded, understanding in her eyes. She finished her coffee and stood. "Well, the nomination stands, whether you want it or not. Some lights can't be hidden, Mr. Mercer, no matter how hard we try." After she left, Jake sat heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face. The quiet of the garage was interrupted by the rumble of a familiar engine, the Admiral's Mustang. Silas walked in a few minutes later, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Saw the mayor leaving," he said. setting one cup on Jake's desk. Looking mighty pleased with herself, Jake groaned. She wants to give me some award. Heart of Valor. Good, Silas said firmly. About time someone recognized what you're doing here. I'm not doing anything special, Jake insisted. And I don't need the spotlight, the attention. Silas interrupted, his voice gruff but kind. Son, I've watched you these past weeks. You're not just fixing cars here. You're fixing people, communities. Jake shook his head. I'm trying to stay out of trouble, Admiral. Keep my head down. Give Maggie a stable life. Silas set his coffee down and fixed Jake with a steady gaze. You don't need to be in the light, Jake. His voice softened. You are the light. Whether you accept that award or not, people see it. They feel it. Yesterday proved that. Jake didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted slightly. Later that evening, Jake arrived home to find Maggie at the kitchen table, surrounded by crayons and construction paper. She quickly tried to hide her work, but Jake caught a glimpse of bright colors and careful lettering. What you got there, sweetheart? He asked, hanging his keys on the hook by the door. Maggie bit her lip, then slowly pulled out the paper she'd been working on. I made something for you, Daddy. Jake's breath caught as he looked at the drawing. In bold, careful letters across the top, she'd written, My daddy is a hero. Below were crayon hearts in every color imaginable, surrounding a stick figure in blue. Coveralls working on a car. Another smaller stick figure stood nearby, holding what looked like a wrench. See? Maggie pointed to the figures. That's you teaching me about cars, like yesterday. And look. She flipped the paper over, where she'd written in her neat third-grade handwriting. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work clothes and help people fix things. Jake stood very still, feeling moisture gather in his eyes. Without a word, he carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into his wallet, right behind Maggie's school picture. Do you like it? Maggie asked, uncertain about his silence. Jake knelt down and pulled her into a tight hug. I love it, baby girl. He whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I love it more than you know. The late May sun beat down on the town square, warming the rows of metal folding chairs set up in neat lines across the freshly mowed grass. American flags fluttered from every lamppost, their stars and stripes casting dancing shadows on the gathered crowd below. The old courthouse's marble steps served as a makeshift stage, its weathered facade a fitting backdrop for this solemn occasion. Jake stood behind the podium, his clean overalls a stark contrast to his usual grease-stained work clothes. His seal badge, polished to a mirror shine, caught the morning light. His prosthetic leg was visible below his rolled-up pant leg, but for the first time in years he made no attempt to hide it. Maggie sat in the front row, wearing her best sundress, her small hands folded in her lap as she beamed up at her father with unmistakable pride. Mayor Brooks's introduction faded into silence, and Jake cleared his throat. The microphone picked up the sound, carrying it across the hushed crowd. His fingers brushed the worn edges of the photograph he'd brought, the same one he often looked at on his porch at night. I never planned to speak here today, he began, his voice steady but quiet. For a long time, I thought staying silent was the best way to honor my fallen brothers. But sometimes, the greatest respect we can show is to tell their story. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it up for all to see. This was taken 6 years ago, just before our last mission together. That's Marcus Chen, our radio specialist. He could fix any piece of equipment with duct tape and determination. Next to him, Tommy Rodriguez, best spotter I ever knew. Sam Wilson, our medic, saved my life twice before that day. And James Cooper, who never met a lock he couldn't pick or a joke he wouldn't tell. Jake's voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. We called ourselves the Night Hunters. The brass called us Shadow Wolf Team. We'd run 57 successful missions together. The 58th was supposed to be routine. The crowd sat in rapt attention as Jake described in carefully measured words the ambush that took his team. He spoke of the explosion that took his leg, of waking up in a field hospital to learn he was the only survivor. His words painted a picture not of violence, but of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the weight of living when others didn't. For 2 years after I was lost, Jake continued, his eyes finding Maggie's in the crowd, I couldn't understand why I survived when they didn't. I disappeared, trying to outrun the guilt. Then one day, I got a call about Marcus's sister. She was in trouble, and she had a little girl. Maggie smiled through tears, and Jake's voice grew stronger. That little girl taught me something my SEAL training never could. She showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply love someone. That being a father, being her father, was the mission I was meant to survive for. He gestured to the garage visible down the street. I chose this town because it reminded me of where I grew up. A place where people know their neighbors, where a man's word still means something. I opened that garage, hoping to build something honest and good. Something my brothers would have been proud of. Jake's eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the faces he'd come to know. Customers, parents from the daddy and daughter day, even some of those who'd once looked at him with suspicion. The same skills that made me a good SEAL. Attention to detail, dedication to getting things right, never giving up on a problem. Those are the same skills I use to fix your cars, to raise my daughter, to be part of this community. He touched his SEAL badge gently. This badge reminds me of who I was, but it's who I am now. A father, a mechanic, a neighbor that honors their memory best because they died believing in something bigger than themselves. They died so others could live in peace, raise their families, chase their dreams. Jake's voice softened. Every morning when I open that garage, every time I help someone get back on the road, every moment I spend with my daughter, I'm living the life they died to protect. And I've learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in simply choosing to begin again, to trust again, to love again. As he finished speaking, the square remained perfectly still. Tears streamed down faces throughout the crowd. Parents held their children closer. Veterans in the audience sat straighter, many wiping their eyes. From his place in the second row, Admiral Silas Grant rose slowly to his feet. His weathered face was solemn as he raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. The gesture carried the weight of years, of shared sacrifice, of understanding that went beyond words. Jake stood at attention, returning the salute with perfect military precision. The moment hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A bridge between who he was and who he'd become, between his past and his present, between loss and redemption. Then Maggie broke from her seat, running up the courthouse steps. Jake knelt down just in time to catch her in his arms, holding her close as she wrapped her small arms around his neck. His tough exterior melted away as he buried his face in her hair, and in that embrace was everything he'd fought for, everything he'd survived for, everything he'd learned to live for again. The sound of applause began softly, then swelled until it filled the square. But Jake barely heard it. In his daughter's arms, he was already home. The night air hung thick and heavy over the small Alabama town. Jake had fallen asleep in his recliner, exhausted from the emotional weight of his Memorial Day speech. Maggie was tucked safely in bed upstairs, her favorite stuffed bear clutched close as always. A sharp crackling sound pierced the quiet. Jake's eyes snapped open, military instincts instantly alert. Something wasn't right. The acrid smell hit him before he saw it. Smoke, dark and oily. It crept under the door connecting the house to the garage. Maggie! Jake bolted upstairs, his prosthetic leg forgotten as he moved with the fluid grace of his SEAL days. He burst into her room, scooping her up along with her bear. "Baby, wake up. We need to get out." Maggie stirred, confused. "Daddy, what's wrong?" "Fire. Hold tight to me." Jake wrapped her in a blanket and carried her down the stairs, moving swiftly but carefully. Through the garage door window, orange flames were already visible, dancing with malicious glee across his tools and equipment. Outside, neighbors were gathering on the street. Mrs. Thompson from next door was already on her phone, calling 911. "Jake? Oh Lord, the garage?" she called out. Jake set Maggie down safely on the grass. "Stay with Mrs. Thompson," he ordered, then sprinted to the garden hose. The flames were spreading fast, consuming years of work and memories. The heat was intense, warping metal and shattering glass. Jake aimed the pathetic stream of water at the base of the fire, but he knew it was futile. This was no accident. The fire was too aggressive, too fast. Sirens wailed in the distance as more neighbors emerged from their homes. Some stood in shocked silence. Others whispered among themselves. A few pulled out phones to record the destruction. Jake kept fighting, even as the heat drove him back step by step. The fire truck arrived, with a screech of brakes, and professional firefighters took over. Jake stumbled back, covered in soot, watching helplessly as his livelihood burned. Maggie ran to him, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her bear. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to shield her from the sight. "My drawings," she whimpered. "All my drawings were in your office." Jake's throat tightened. Those crayon masterpieces had decorated his walls for years. "It's okay, baby. You can make new ones." But his voice cracked on the words. The firefighters worked efficiently, but it was too late to save much. The flames had done their work well. As the last embers were doused, Jake stood in what remained of his shop. The roof had partially collapsed. Tools he'd collected over years were warped beyond recognition. The careful organization of parts and pieces was now just twisted metal and ash. Chief Martinez approached, his face grim. "Jake, this wasn't natural. We found evidence of accelerant. Someone did this deliberately." Jake nodded numbly. He'd known, of course. The threatening note, the swastika. This was just the final act. He watched as the fire trucks packed up their equipment and drove away, their red lights reflecting off the wet, blackened ruins of his dreams. Maggie hadn't left his side, her small hand gripping his tightly. Her bear was stained with soot where she'd pressed it against his dirty clothes. The neighbors gradually dispersed, leaving father and daughter alone in the pre-dawn darkness. Jake knelt in the ashes, picking up a charred wrench. It had been his father's, passed down when he first started working on cars. Now, it was just another piece of debris. He let it fall from his fingers, the clang of metal on concrete echoing in the empty shell of his shop. The sky began to lighten, pink and orange streaks mocking the destruction below. Jake hadn't moved from the dining room table since coming inside to clean up. He sat there, still as stone, staring at nothing. His coffee had gone cold, untouched. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her bear dragging on the floor behind her. She'd changed clothes, but her face was smudged where tears had cut through the soot. Her small voice broke the heavy silence. "Are we leaving town?" Jake didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The light that had finally returned to his eyes after years of darkness, the purpose he'd found in this small town, it was all ashes now. His hands lay open and empty on the table, covered in cuts and burns he didn't remember getting. The words of his Memorial Day speech echoed mockingly in his mind. Hope, community, new beginnings. Maggie waited for an answer that didn't come. Her father, her hero, sat broken at the table, as gray and lifeless as the ruins of their garage. The morning sun streamed through the window, but it couldn't reach the darkness in Jake's eyes. The morning sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across cardboard boxes scattered throughout Jake's living room. Each box represented another piece of their life being packed away, another admission of defeat. The garage's destruction had shaken Jake to his core, leaving him hollow inside. "Please, Daddy, don't make us leave." Maggie stood in the doorway, her small fingers clutching the doorframe. Her eyes were red from crying, and her normally bouncy curls hung limp around her face. "This is our home." Jake paused, a framed photo of their first day in the house halfway into a box. His hands trembled slightly as he set it back down. "Sometimes, sweetheart, we have to make hard choices to keep safe. But you said we don't run anymore." Maggie's voice cracked. "You promised." Jake's throat tightened as he remembered that conversation. They'd been sitting on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. He told her stories about his SEAL team, about standing strong in the face of fear. "Baby, this is different," he managed. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Maggie stepped forward, her chin lifted with determination that reminded him so much of himself. "No, it's not. You told me 2 weeks ago. We shine, Daddy. We don't hide." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "You said that's what heroes do." The box in Jake's hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He set it down, his prosthetic leg creaking as he lowered himself to one knee in front of his daughter. Her small hands reached for his face, wiping away tears he hadn't even realized were falling. "You're right," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "You're so right, baby girl." Maggie wrapped her arms around his neck, and Jake felt his walls crumbling. All the pain, fear, and anger he'd been holding back since watching his garage burn came pouring out. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he held his daughter, his anchor in the storm. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly, something he'd never said aloud before. Not in combat, not during his recovery, not even when he'd first taken on raising Maggie alone. "Me too," she whispered back, her breath warm against his neck. "But we're scared together, right?" Jake pulled back slightly, looking into his daughter's eyes. Eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 8 years. "Together," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Maggie took his large calloused hand in her small one and tugged gently. "We should pray, Daddy, like we do every night." Jake nodded, allowing her to guide him. They knelt together beside the half-packed boxes, hands clasped. Maggie's voice was clear and strong as she began. "Dear God, please help Daddy remember. He's strong. Help him remember that you didn't bring us this far to leave us. Help us be brave, even when it's hard." She squeezed his hand. "And please help the mean people who hurt us learn about love instead of hate." Jake's heart swelled with pride and humility at his daughter's simple, powerful prayer. "Amen," he whispered, adding his own silent plea for guidance. They stayed kneeling together for several moments, the morning sun warming their backs through the window. The quiet was broken by the sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway. Multiple engines. From the sound of it, Jake tensed instinctively, old combat reflexes kicking in. He moved toward the window, positioning himself to keep Maggie behind him. But as he peered out through the glass, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the driveway, stood Admiral Silas Grant, ramrod straight in his VFW cap. Behind him, filling the entire driveway and spilling onto the street, stood dozens of veterans, men and women in VFW caps and jackets, some with canes or wheelchairs, others standing tall despite their years. They formed a solid wall of support, their faces set with determination. Silas stepped forward as Jake opened the front door, Maggie's hand still firmly in his. "We shine, son," Silas said simply, echoing Maggie's words. "We don't hide." He gestured to the gathered veterans. "And we sure as hell don't let our own fight alone. Let's rebuild." The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the first pickup trucks began arriving at Jake's burned-out garage. Through his kitchen window, Jake watched in disbelief as dozens of townspeople poured out of their vehicles, armed with work gloves, shovels, and determined expressions. Silas stood at the center of it all, barking orders like he was back on the bridge of a destroyer. "Johnson, get those wheelbarrows over here. Martinez family, we need those trash bins lined up along the fence. Pastor Mike, your crew can start with the south wall." Jake stepped out onto his front porch, Maggie close behind him. The morning air still carried the acrid smell of smoke, but there was something else to Hope, carried on the backs of neighbors he barely knew. "Daddy, look." Maggie tugged at his sleeve, pointing to Mrs. Chen from the bakery directing her teenage sons as they unloaded boxes of donuts and thermoses of coffee from their van. "I see, sweetheart." Jake's voice was rough with emotion. A big yellow excavator rumbled up the street, its operator giving a friendly wave. Tom Wilson, the local contractor, jumped down from the cab. "Thought you might need some heavy lifting done," he called out. "Free of charge, Jake. It's the least we can do after what you've done for our girls." Maggie bounced on her toes. "Can I help too, Daddy?" Jake managed a small smile. "Of course. But first, let's thank these people properly." They walked together toward the growing crowd. Someone had set up folding tables with water bottles and work gloves. The sound of shovels scraping against concrete mixed with cheerful conversation and occasional laughter. "Jake!" Silas waved him over. The Admiral's usually pristine clothing was replaced by old jeans and a work shirt. "Got something to tell you." He pulled Jake aside, speaking quietly. "Sold the Mustang this morning. Got a good price, too, enough to cover a good chunk of the rebuilding costs." Jake shook his head. "Admiral, I can't accept. You can and you will, son." Silas's voice was firm but gentle. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is accept help when he needs it. Before Jake could argue further, 3 church vans pulled up, loaded with lumber, tools, and building supplies. Pastor Mike's wife, Sarah, organized a line of volunteers to unload everything, while their teenage daughter started a sign-up sheet for different work crews. Maggie disappeared into the house and returned minutes later with a massive plate of chocolate chip cookies she'd been saving for school. "Mrs. Chen," she called out, "can I put these with your donuts?" The baker's face lit up. "Of course, sweet girl. Come help me set up a proper snack station." Throughout the morning, more people arrived. The high school shop teacher brought his personal tools. The owner of the hardware store showed up with a flatbed full of supplies. Even Mr. Thompson, who had once crossed the street to avoid Jake, was there with his construction crew, already drawing up plans for the new foundation. Jake moved through it all in a daze, watching as the charred remains of his garage were slowly cleared away. Every time he tried to help, someone would press a bottle of water into his hands or ask him to look at their rebuilding plans. It was as if the town had decided that his job today was simply to accept their gift of service. Near noon, Maggie made her rounds with fresh cookies, stopping to chat with each volunteer. Jake watched her proud smile as people praised her baking. She'd been right all along. They didn't need to run. This was home. The local news crew showed up, but Silas intercepted them before they could approach Jake. "This isn't a story," he told them firmly. "This is family taking care of family. You want to help? Grab a shovel." To everyone's surprise, the reporter and cameraman did just that, setting aside their equipment to join the cleanup effort. As the sun began to set, Jake stood in what used to be his office. The walls were gone, the roof was missing, but somehow his old desk had survived, though it was water-damaged and scarred with smoke. He pulled out the drawer where he'd kept that threatening note from just weeks ago. The drawer was empty now. The hate-filled words turned to ash, like everything else. Later that night, after Maggie had fallen asleep, Jake sat at their kitchen table with a pen and paper. He tried to write a thank you letter to the town, but every attempt felt inadequate. How could words on paper express the depth of his gratitude? Each spark of kindness cast more light than any flame of hatred. He wrote, then crossed it out. "Your generosity rebuilt more than just a garage." He tried again, but that wasn't right either. After an hour of failed attempts, Jake gathered the crumpled papers and carried them to the fireplace. One by one, he fed them to the flames. The words might have been inadequate, but as he watched them burn, he knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would thank them in person. Sometimes, the simplest truths needed to be spoken face to face. The fire consumed the last of his written attempts. But unlike the destructive blaze that had taken his garage, this one felt cleansing. Through the window, he could still see the outlines of equipment and supplies left by the volunteers, ready for another day of rebuilding. Not just rebuilding a garage, he realized, but rebuilding trust, community, and hope. Jake touched the spot in his wallet where he kept Maggie's crayon drawing. My daddy is a hero. He'd seen that heroism wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about a community coming together, about people choosing light over darkness, love over hate. He turned away from the fireplace, leaving the ashes of his attempted thank you letters behind. Tomorrow would be soon enough to find the right words. Tonight he would simply be grateful for the miracle of neighbors becoming family, of destruction giving way to renewal, and of a little girl who never lost faith in the power of standing your ground and letting your light shine. For veterans, fathers, and future dreams. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Jake watched the transformation unfold before him. What had started as a cleanup effort had turned into something far more profound. Over the past week, the charred remains of his old garage had given way to something new, something bigger than himself. Workers moved with purpose, their boots crunching on fresh gravel. The air hummed with the sound of power tools and friendly chatter. The new building stood proud and tall, its metal siding gleaming in the early light. It was larger than the original, with 2 extra bays and a proper waiting room. "Daddy, look!" Maggie tugged at his sleeve, pointing to where 2 men were carefully mounting the new sign. The letters caught the sunlight bold and clean. Shadow Wolf Garage. Jake's throat tightened. Below the main sign, smaller letters spelled out, "For veterans, fathers, and future dreams." He hadn't asked for this, any of it. The community had insisted. "It's perfect," he managed, squeezing Maggie's hand. Silas approached, his weathered face creased in a smile. "The mural team is ready when you are, Jake." The west wall had been prepared for something special. Jake pulled out an old photograph from his wallet, creased and worn, but clear enough. His SEAL team, all of them grinning, arms around each other's shoulders, young, alive, forever frozen in that moment of brotherhood. The artists worked with quiet reverence, transferring the image to the wall. Each face emerged with careful detail, not just a painting, but a memorial. Jake stood watching, his prosthetic leg aching from standing so long, but he couldn't move. He owed them this much. "They'd be proud," Silas said softly, standing beside him, "especially of what you've built here." Inside, the garage was state-of-the-art. The VFW had rallied other veterans organizations, and donations had poured in. New lifts gleamed under LED lights. The tool chest was fully stocked. But it was the little touches that kept catching Jake's eye: the coffee station in the waiting room, the small play area for kids, the discreet ramp beside the steps. Maggie had been busy too. She'd set up her office in the corner of the waiting room, a small desk with crayons and paper, for when other kids come with their dads, she'd explained. By mid-afternoon, the mural was complete. Jake stood before it, taking in each familiar face. His team watched over the garage now, their presence a reminder of why he'd chosen this path. Not just to honor their memory, but to build something new from the ashes of loss. "Time for the ribbon cutting," Silas announced, appearing with a large red ribbon and scissors. Jake shook his head. "No ceremony, please." "Just this once," Silas insisted. "Let people celebrate with you." A small crowd had gathered: workers, volunteers, neighbors. Many faces Jake now recognized from the Memorial Day ceremony. Even a few of the fathers who'd attended the Daddy and Daughter Day stood among them, their girls perched on their shoulders. Maggie took the scissors from Silas and held them out to Jake. Together, Jake knelt beside her, wrapping his large hand around her small one on the scissors handle. The ribbon parted with a satisfying snip, and spontaneous applause broke out. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake noticed something else: a small brass plaque beside the entrance. He hadn't authorized this. Moving closer, he read, "Dedicated to those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who carry on. Remember, we shine, we don't hide." His own words, spoken to Maggie, now cast in metal. A permanent reminder. The last of the workers and well-wishers trickled away as evening approached. Silas lingered, helping Jake arrange the final details inside. They worked in comfortable silence, each movement purposeful. "You know," Silas said finally, "when I first recognized you in those coveralls, I thought I was seeing a ghost. Now I realize I was seeing the future." Jake nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," he managed finally. "For everything." Silas squeezed his shoulder and headed for the door. "Make us proud, Shadow Wolf." The waiting room, her latest drawing, clutched in her hand. Jake gently took it from her fingers. It showed the garage, with stick figures of various sizes standing in front. "My family" was written across the top in crooked letters. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Jake stood in the doorway of his new garage. No, his new mission. The mural caught the last rays of sunlight, his team watching over him. The sign above gleamed, "Shadow Wolf Garage." With Maggie sleeping peacefully inside and the quiet of evening settling around him, Jake reached for the switch. The open sign hummed to life, casting a warm glow into the gathering dusk. For the first time in years, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. This was where he belonged. Jake took a deep breath and smiled. He was at peace, finally. The morning sun cast long shadows across the newly painted walls of Shadow Wolf Garage. Jake stood back, admiring the fresh lettering above the entrance. The new sign gleamed, "For veterans, fathers, and future dreams." Beside him, Maggie bounced on her toes, her small hand wrapped in his. "It's so pretty, Daddy," she said, beaming at the mural of his SEAL team that now adorned the eastern wall. The sound of scuffling feet made Jake turn. Two teenage boys stood at the edge of the parking lot, their shoulders hunched, faces drawn with tension. One boy, tall and lanky with disheveled brown hair, kept his eyes fixed on the ground. The other, shorter with freckles spread across his pale face, gave his friend a gentle push forward. Jake recognized the taller boy immediately, Tommy Matthews, the troubled kid from church who'd lost his father in Afghanistan. Jake had tried reaching out to him months ago, offering to teach him about cars. But Tommy had shut him out. "Can I help you boys?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral. He felt Maggie squeeze his hand tighter. Tommy took a shaky step forward, his friend hanging back. "Mr. Mercer," his voice cracked. I need to tell you something." Jake noticed the boy's hands trembling. He knelt down to Maggie's level. "Sugar, why don't you go check on those new socket sets we got yesterday? Make sure they're all in order?" Maggie looked between her father and the boys, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, Daddy." She disappeared into the garage. The morning traffic hummed in the distance as Jake waited patiently. A small crowd had gathered for the garage's reopening, and he could feel their eyes on this unfolding scene. "I'm the one who—" Tommy's voice broke again. He swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm the one who spray-painted the garage. And I started the fire." The admission hung heavy in the air. Several gasps came from the onlookers. Jake remained still, his face calm despite the revelation. "My friend Billy tried to stop me," Tommy continued, gesturing to the freckled boy behind him. "But I was so angry. At everything. At you." The tears began falling, freely now. "You tried to help me. And I just couldn't stand seeing you with your daughter, having what I lost." Jake took a step closer, his prosthetic leg clicking softly against the concrete. "Keep going, son. When you spoke at Memorial Day about losing your team, about finding purpose again," Tommy's shoulders shook with sobs, "I realized you knew exactly how I felt about losing Dad. And I'd done something terrible to you." Billy moved forward to support his friend, but Tommy waved him off. He straightened his back, trying to find strength. "I was wrong. So wrong. And I'm sorry." Tommy's voice cracked again. "I'll turn myself in. To the police. I'll work to pay for everything. I couldn't live with myself anymore without telling you." The crowd had grown larger now. Silas stood at the front, his weathered face tight with emotion. Several veterans from the VFW who'd helped rebuild were there too, along with families from church. Jake took another step forward. He could see the fear in Tommy's eyes, the expectation of punishment, of rejection. It was a look he knew well. He'd seen it in his own reflection years ago. After losing his team, Tommy, Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me, son." The teenager raised his tear-stained face. "Hate is a chain," Jake said, his words carrying across the now silent parking lot. "It weighs you down, keeps you trapped, makes you do things you never thought you'd do." He glanced at the mural of his SEAL team, then back at Tommy. "I've carried that chain too. After I lost my team, I wanted to burn the whole world down." Jake reached out and placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "But that chain? You're free now. The moment you chose truth over fear, chose to face what you'd done, you broke it." Tommy stared at him in disbelief. But I destroyed your garage. Everything you built." Jake gestured at the new building. "Look around, son. What was destroyed got rebuilt. Better than before. Sometimes that's how healing works." He squeezed Tommy's shoulder. "I forgive you." The sound of spontaneous applause broke through the morning air. People were wiping tears from their eyes, and Silas had to turn away for a moment, using his handkerchief to dab at his face. Tommy's legs seemed to give out, and Jake caught him in a hug as the boy broke down completely. Billy watched from nearby, relief written across his features. "Mr. Mercer," Tommy managed between sobs, "I don't deserve this." Jake held him steady. "None of us deserve grace, son. That's what makes it grace." The applause continued to roll through the crowd. Maggie had reappeared in the doorway, her small face split with a knowing smile. She caught her father's eye and gave him a thumbs up. Tommy finally pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "What? What happens now?" "Now?" Jake looked at the newly painted sign above them. "Now you help me live up to what that sign promises. You'll work here after school, learn about cars, about responsibility, and maybe—" he glanced at the mural again. "Maybe you'll learn what your father and my team died protecting the chance. To choose love over hate every single day." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting its warm light across the new beginning, unfolding in the parking lot of Shadow Wolf Garage. The applause finally died down. But the feeling of healing, of chains being broken, lingered in the air like a promise. The autumn breeze carried the scent of cotton candy and barbecue through the town square. Streamers in red, white, and blue danced between lampposts, and a banner stretched across Main Street proclaimed, "Shadow Wolf Garage Grand Opening Festival." Children darted between food stalls, while parents chatted in clusters, their laughter mixing with the twang of country music from the temporary stage. Jake stood at the edge of the crowd, his prosthetic leg hidden beneath pressed khakis. He tugged at his collar, uncomfortable in the button-down shirt Maggie had picked out. She stood beside him in her favorite yellow sundress, her dark curls tied back with matching ribbons. "Daddy, look, they've got face painting." Maggie pointed excitedly at a booth where kids emerged with butterflies and superhero masks painted on their cheeks. "Maybe later, sweetheart," Jake said, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. He spotted Silas approaching in his formal Navy dress uniform, medals glinting in the sunlight. "You clean up nice, Shadow Wolf," Silas said with a warm smile, "though you look about as comfortable as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Jake chuckled. Give me engine grease and overalls any day. The mayor stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. He hadn't agreed to this part of the celebration, but Silas had insisted it was important for the important town. Today, we're not just celebrating the opening of a business, the mayor continued. We're celebrating community, redemption, and the power of standing together against hatred. He paused, his eyes finding Jake in the crowd. Would Jake Mercer please join me on stage? Maggie squeezed his hand. Go on, Daddy. You're their hero. Jake swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. With gentle determination, he made his way through the parting crowd. Each step up to the stage echoed with purpose, his prosthetic leg carrying him forward just as surely as his natural one. The mayor held up a wooden plaque, its surface catching the sunlight. This is our town's Heart of Valor Award, given to those who exemplify extraordinary courage and service to our community. Jake raised his hand. Sir, I can't accept this alone. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying clear and strong. Maggie, come up here, princess. Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. She hurried through the crowd, her yellow dress bright against the sea of faces. Jake lifted her onto the stage, and she stood beside him, beaming with pride. This award, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, belongs to every person who showed up with hammers and paintbrushes, to every veteran who shared their stories, to every father who brought their daughter to learn about cars. He placed his hand on Maggie's shoulder, and most of all, to this little girl who taught me that running away isn't the answer. The crowd broke into applause. Silas stood at attention, his eyes glistening. You know, Jake continued as the applause died down, I spent years in combat zones, thinking that's where the real battles were fought. But I was wrong. He looked down at Maggie, who smiled up at him encouragingly. The real fights happen right here, in our hearts and in our communities. They happen when we choose love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, and hope over fear. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. In the 100-padded front row, Jake spotted the two teenage boys who had vandalized his garage. They stood with their heads high now, wearing Shadow Wolf Garage t-shirts and volunteer badges. When my garage burned down, I wanted to run. It was what I knew how to do. Disappear, start over, somewhere else. Jake's voice grew stronger. But my daughter reminded me of something important. She said, We shine, Daddy. We don't hide. Maggie wrapped her arms around his waist, and Jake had to pause to steady his voice. This town taught me that true strength isn't in how well you fight, but in how well you love. It's in how you get back up when life knocks you down. It's in how you help others stand when they fall. The mayor stepped forward with a plaque, but Jake wasn't finished. He looked out at the faces before him, veterans, neighbors, friends, and even former enemies, all united in this moment. You don't need to fight wars to be a warrior, Jake said, his words ringing across the square. Sometimes you just have to love harder. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, rising to their feet in a wave of emotion. Cheers and whistles filled the air as Jake stood tall, one arm around his daughter, the other holding the Heart of Valor Award that belonged not just to him, but to an entire community that had learned to shine together. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the freshly painted Shadow Wolf Garage, where the joyful sounds of laughter and bluegrass music filled the warm Alabama air. A gentle breeze caught the edges of the new Shine On banner, making the bright yellow fabric dance against the cloudless sky like a beacon of hope. The banner itself was Maggie's idea, hand-painted letters in her careful 8-year-old script, surrounded by tiny drawings of wrenches and hearts. Jake leaned against his familiar workbench, its surface now cleared of engine parts and covered instead with colorful activity sheets. He watched with quiet, satisfaction as fathers and daughters crowded around a vintage engine block he'd set up as a teaching station. Their faces glowed with curiosity and wonder, some tentative, others bold with excitement. The sight reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten, that learning could be pure joy. "Okay, everyone," Jake called out, his voice carrying easily through the transformed space. The hubbub quieted as eager faces turned toward him. "Who can tell me what this little part does for the engine?" He held up a spark plug between his thumb and forefinger, its metal surface catching the light. Immediately, a forest of small hands shot into the air, some waving frantically for attention. "Pick me! Pick me!" called out little Emma, her pigtails bouncing as she jumped up and down beside her father, a soft-spoken accountant who'd never touched an engine before today. Maggie sat cross-legged on a clean paint-splattered drop cloth in the corner, her own workspace, surrounded by younger girls who looked up to her with obvious admiration. She was helping them piece together colorful plastic model engines, her patience gentle and encouraging. Her dark curls were tied back with a rainbow ribbon that caught the light when she moved, and her junior mechanic badge, a gift from Silas, gleamed proudly on the chest of her miniature coveralls. Every time Jake spoke to the group, she'd pause in her work to look up at him with such pure pride that it made his chest tight with emotion. The entire garage had been transformed for this special Daddy-Daughter Day. Strings of warm fairy lights twinkled along the metal rafters like indoor stars, and cheerful red checkered tablecloths covered the workbenches that now groaned under the weight of homemade dishes brought by grateful mothers. The rich aroma of Mrs. Johnson's famous apple pie mingled with the familiar sense of motor oil and clean metal, creating an atmosphere that was oddly comforting, a blend of home and honest work. "Daddy!" Maggie called out suddenly, her sweet voice cutting through the gentle noise. She waved him over with paint-stained fingers. "Sarah's daddy doesn't know how to change oil in his truck yet. Can you show him the right way?" Jake's smile came easily now, no longer feeling foreign on his face. He made his way through the crowd of families, stepping carefully around little girls in frilly dresses who were sprawled on the concrete floor, absorbed in their engine puzzles. Several veterans who'd become regular fixtures at the shop nodded respectfully as he passed. These were men who understood what it meant to find purpose again, and they'd brought their own daughters to share in this healing space. The sight of tough, calloused hands gently guiding small fingers around wrench handles had become wonderfully common here. Tom Bradley, Sarah's father and a newcomer to town, stood nervously beside an old pickup truck Jake had wheeled into the demonstration area. His work shirt was still crisp and clean, marking him as someone more comfortable with spreadsheets than spark plugs. "Remember, everyone," Jake addressed the gathered crowd, his tone patient and encouraging. "It's about learning something new together." His hands moved with practiced precision as he demonstrated the oil change, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, making sure even the smallest onlookers could follow along. The most important tool in any garage isn't a wrench or a drill. It's patience. From the doorway of the small office, Admiral Silas Grant stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold before him. His weathered face, usually set in stern lines from decades of military command, had softened into something approaching wonder. The transformation in Jake over the past months was nothing short of remarkable, from a man living in shadows to someone who'd become a beacon of light for this entire community. The way children gravitated toward him, the way grown men sought his guidance, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, instead of haunted wariness. It all spoke to the healing power of purpose and love. The afternoon stretched on with a comfortable rhythm. Many workshops rotated every 30 minutes, covering everything from basic car maintenance to small engine repair. Between lessons, there were impromptu storytelling sessions where Jake would spin tales about engines that came to life, and dance breaks when someone's daughter insisted on showing off her latest ballet moves on the smooth concrete floor. Jake moved through it all with quiet grace, his military training visible only in the efficient way he organized tools and his careful attention to everyone's safety. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Mothers started arriving to collect their families. The garage gradually emptied, filled with heartfelt thank yous and eager promises to return for the next event. Jake stood by the main bay door, watching as little girls in grass-stained dresses dragged their reluctant fathers toward family cars, chattering excitedly about everything they'd learned. Shadow Wolf Garage, mused Marcus Williams, one of the Vietnam veterans who'd become both friend and informal advisor. He clapped Jake on the shoulder with a hand that bore old scars from his own war. Never thought I'd see the day when that call sign would mean hope instead of fear. Jake nodded slowly, feeling the full weight of those words settle into his bones. The garage had evolved into something far beyond a simple business. It had become a sanctuary where broken things and broken people could find healing together, where the tools of destruction could be transformed into instruments of creation and connection. Maggie moved through the aftermath with cheerful determination, humming a tune she'd learned in music class as she collected paper plates and plastic cups. Her small hands worked methodically, but Jake could see her movements growing slower, her eyes heavy with the special kind of exhaustion that comes from a day filled with joy and purpose. "Come here, princess," Jake called softly, setting down the wrench he'd been organizing. She immediately dropped the half-full trash bag and walked into his open arms without hesitation. He lifted her easily, marveling as always at how perfectly her small form fit against his chest, how her head found its natural resting place on his shoulder. The cleanup could wait until tomorrow. Jake carried his drowsy daughter out to the front porch, where evening shadows were beginning to pool in the corners. He settled them both into the sturdy wooden swing he'd installed just last week, its chains creaking gently under their combined weight. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the last whispers of summer and the promise of autumn's approach. Maggie's breathing grew steady and deep as sleep began to claim her. Her small hand curled trustingly against his chest. Jake gazed out at the gathering twilight, his mind drifting to other evenings in faraway places, desert nights when he'd thought he'd never know peace like this, when the idea of holding a sleeping child seemed like an impossible dream. The weight of his daughter anchored him firmly to the present moment, keeping the shadows of his past at bay like a talisman against darkness. The soft crunch of gravel announced Silas's quiet approach. The Admiral moved with careful respect, his footsteps deliberately light so as not to disturb the peaceful scene before him. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his military bearing still evident despite his civilian clothes and the years that had softened his edges. No words were needed between them. The two men looked at each other across the space that separated them, understanding flowing between them like a river finding its course. The past had been acknowledged. Forgiveness had been offered and accepted. And now they stood on the far shore of something new. Then, with deliberate and ceremonial movement, Silas raised his weathered hand in a formal military salute, not to the warrior Jake had once been, but to the man he'd chosen to become. It was a gesture of respect, of recognition, of completion. Jake felt something deep within his chest, finally, settle into place. He shifted carefully in the swing, keeping Maggie secure and warm against him. Her peaceful breathing, a constant reminder of what truly mattered. For the first time since leaving the service, since losing his team, since thinking he'd lost himself, he returned the salute with precision and quiet pride. Shadow Wolf had indeed returned not to the battlefield, but to life itself. And this time, surrounded by love and purpose and the gentle sounds of home, he wasn't going anywhere. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the B ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jake Shadow Wolf Mercer, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.